Hello everyone, my name is Ruben and welcome to another video here on the channel. In this video, we're going to look at Mixpanel. This is one of my favorite analytics tools. I've been using it for, 8, 9, 10 years maybe. And I know the tool quite well, and I think it's a very, very powerful tool when you set it up correctly, when you give it the right data, and of course, when you understand how to use the tool. So over the next little while, I want to show you exactly how you can get started with Mixpanel. I want to walk you through some of the use cases so you understand exactly what it can do and what it cannot do to make sure you're looking at the right tools. Look a little bit about the pricing to understand what this might look like. Then we're going to talk about tracking plans. This is a step that happens before you ever write any code. I want to give you some tips there. We're going to look at SDKs, specifically the distinction between client events and backend events. What's it look like, what to think about. And then, of course, we're going to look at some implementation best practices, and we'll finish with the tool itself. So we're going to look at the major elements of Mixpanel, the things that are, I believe are the most important and the ones that you should become very, very familiar with. So with that all being said, let's jump right in. So let's start by understanding exactly what Mixpanel is and what it is not. It is really positioned as a product analytics tool that is a product team, typically within software companies, or at least companies that have some kind of digital product. Think of like a website, a web app, or a mobile app. They're going to use this tool to understand what is going on within the product itself. So even in the home screen itself, I find there's great examples here, right? We may be looking at specific features. How are the features themselves being adopted by the user base? What's the retention? How is the onboarding coming along? Where are users getting stuck? How can we improve engagement, and so forth? You could use this for things that are not apps. Let's say just a regular website. If we imagine something like a newspaper, perhaps like an online newspaper. But generally, the more intricate your product is, typically apps of some kind, the more useful data you can get out of it. I have done Mixpanel implementations for whether very simple marketing websites, and there is some use there, but it's honestly not as much. You're probably better served by something like Google Analytics, which was designed for that specific use case, just understanding simple websites. Now, beyond product analytics, you of course have some marketing analytics as well. So I've also worked with many marketing teams who want to use this because they want to understand the impact of their marketing efforts, the campaigns, not just on the top level metrics, think page views and even signups, but they want to understand the impact all the way down the funnel. So they want to understand if we acquire users from Facebook ads or Meta ads today, or Google ads, whether it's actually the impact on how many people signed up, how many people complete the onboarding, how many people become retained 1 month later, how many people become engaged, how many people make purchases or become subscribers, and so forth. And those are things that, of course, are happening very deep inside the product. So we need a tool that can do that. So those are really the primary use cases that I see from Mixpanel. I'm sure there might be a few other ones. But when we look at their product menu here, is roughly the same thing, right? Acquiring new users, grow the business to improve the product. If you're really interested in anything that's product-led growth, Mixpanel, of course, is an instrumental tool in doing that. There's some enterprise and so on, right? And this is some of the ways in which Mixpanel has gone from just building charts and reports into trying to become more of the full cycle, sort of the entire thinking cycle for a product team or a marketing team to understand, this is a trend that's going on. Here's a campaign. Here's an A/B test that we just ran. Here's a new feature that we release. What are we doing, right? We're coming up with ideas. We're validating those ideas. We're making decisions and so forth. Let me see if we answer. Now, this little GIF here, this animated picture, is a great example. The Mixpanel reports are typically easy to use. It's really a tool that's designed for non-technical folks. So if you're someone, or if your team are full of individuals who understand SQL, they can connect to databases and data warehouses on their own, they can sort of run their own queries, Mixpanel might be a bit of an overkill. It might still be useful, but you have to understand that the interface that you see here and you're going to see later on in this video It's really almost like a pseudo SQL interface. The functions are actually quite similar. You're doing group bys, you're doing selects, you're doing filters, but you're doing it in an interface that's point and click, and that is, in my experience, very easy to learn for someone who doesn't have a technical background. This again goes back to product teams. Not every product team is technical. Some are. I work with very, very technical product teams, but for those that are not, Mixpanel is a great intermediate step where the data itself will be implemented by engineers, the same engineers who may not need it because they can use SQL themselves, but these engineers can then give the data and a tool to a marketing team or a product team that can then build reports on their own. And this is kind of key. Really, the reason why you go with some of the Mixpanel is because you want your product people and your marketing people to build their own reports. You can give them reports pre-built. You can give them training, but ideally they want to get to the point where they're self-sufficient. And I work with lots of product teams, and we can get there. They can get to a point where a product manager can be very, very self-sufficient and build on their own funnels and reports and dashboards and insights. And it's a lot of freedom that can be very, very powerful because you don't have to wait. You have to put a request for a report and then wait a week to get it and then maybe tweak it because you forgot something. You can do everything yourself within a few minutes. But there's some prerequisites to make that happen, which we'll talk about. Let me see what else we got going on here. If anything else I want to mention here, data warehouse and so on, we'll cover that a little bit. And so Mixpanel has been around for a long time. I want to say since 2008. Might be my guess. So they've been a very well established product. In this space of product analytics, there's really a handful of companies that dominate the space. You have Mixpanel, you have Amplitude, Pendo, Heap will be other ones that come to mind. There's lots of other options that have, of course, risen since 2008, but Mixpanel and Amplitude in particular are typically the two big heavyweights here. We're going to look at Mixpanel today. Amplitude, there's other videos on my channel if you want to look at that. I want to focus specifically on Mixpanel. So the product is very well thought out. It has all the essential features. There's a lot of design tweaks that I think make the product fantastic. That you can tell the company has really thought about deeply what it means to create reports and dashboards as a non-technical person. So there's a lot of little details that have been added into the product to make it a very enjoyable product to use once you have a handle on it. This is a product I use every week, multiple times per week, and there's very little friction once you start to get into the data and to build reports and so on. It does exactly what you want it to do. Now, putting the use cases aside, assuming this is the use case that you care about, let's look at the pricing. Now, the Mixpanel app pricing and to some extent the entire space has really changed a lot over a few years. These days, Mixpanel focuses on events. Typically, tools in the space charge in two ways. Either they charge by number of events per month, what Mixpanel does, or they charge by users, what's typically called MTUs, monthly track users. Other tools like Segment.com in particular use MTUs. There's pros and cons to each approach. Generally speaking, if you're a consumer product, you're going to have lots of users with a lower value per user. Imagine like a mobile game. You might have 1 million users using the game, but the average revenue per user is quite low. So these companies that have high number of users and a low value of users typically benefit from an event-driven model like what Mixpanel offers, because you can fire lots of events with an unlimited number of users, right? If you look at the free plan here, you have 20 million events. Depending on how you design your tracking schema, your tracking plan, which we're going to see in a second, you could legitimately cover lots of actions for all your 1 million users without going over the free plan. The other type of business are typically more B2B. So a B2B product, imagine some kind of, accounting software. They might have a small number of users. They may only have, let's say, 30,000 users that are all small businesses, but the value per user is much higher. Typically, these businesses really benefit from a monthly track user model because they have a small number of users, the 30,000, which tend to fall nicely in the lower price initial tiers. If I remember Amplitude, for example, I think their initial tier goes up to 100,000 monthly track users. This is a very common threshold. So you can track all your users and you can track as many actions as you want. because you have, fewer than 100,000. But again, pros and cons. In Mixpanel, we're dealing with events. So when you think about them, the initial plan is very generous with 20 million events. I find for a lot of startups, companies that are just launched their product, this is completely fine to get started with. There's a few things that are not there, which I'll cover here in a second, but the free plan gives you a good starting point to get comfortable with Mixpanel, get some data in. And then when we look at the paid plans, we can then start to do some estimates on how many events you might have. What does 1 million events per month look like? If we have perhaps 5 million events per month, we're looking at about $612 per month, and annually it's about $5,000 and so on, right? So you get some savings. There is a couple add-ons, which we'll see here in a second. Here, for example, data pipelines. If you want to export data to data warehouses like BigQuery, Amazon Redshift, and so on, this is an add-on that goes on top of that. There's also group analytics. Again, group analytics tend to make sense for B2B companies. So if you imagine going back to the same example of the accountant software, every customer, every small business might have multiple users. So perhaps you're working with, a coffee shop, and the coffee shop has multiple chains. So there's going to be 10 users for each coffee shop. So group analytics allows you to create those groups. It allows you to take individual users and then group them under a company of sorts. So this makes sense for B2B, not so much for B2C. So this is the event volume. Generally, the way Mixpanel recommends here, if you actually look at how to choose event volume, is they'll tell you typically just to kind of set up Mixpanel, let it run for a month or so, and then it'll give you what is your event volume. You can estimate this if you have any other existing data. For example, if you have Google Analytics already set up, you can look at how many users have been tracked over the last month, look how many events those users fire, and do some rough estimates. Generally, though, I find, beyond the estimate, the best way tends to be just to do an initial implementation and then look at what you get. You can modify the number of events you get depending on what you track and you don't track. I've done this with many companies where we say, hey, we need to stay within 5 million events per month. How can we do that? And then we start to make trade-offs in terms of what events we track. So that's a possibility. It's an option, especially if you're just getting started and you're trying to get some proof of concept before you ramp up the price. And of course, there's always an enterprise level plan with the typical things you might find in enterprise pricing, SSO, data governance. And now let's quickly look at some of the things you don't get in the free plan versus the growth plan, just so you have a general sense of what's there and what's not. This is kind of interesting. Spark AI is Mixpanel's add-on to use natural language like LLMs to be able to go through your data. I haven't had much experience with this myself, primarily because for me, it's faster to build this. Once I know the data and I know Mixpanel so deeply, it's faster for me to do it on my own. But it's an interesting add-on that can make the ramp up for people who are just getting familiar with the data, with Mixpanel, to get into it. So you have a certain number of queries per month. The couple things that I find quite limited in the plan for you to note, formulas and saved metrics. So you can create custom formulas that are just beyond your initial data point. So think, we're gonna track marketing attribution is an example I used recently. So we're gonna take our UTM parameters of UTM source, UTM campaign, UTM medium, that tells us where users came from, what marketing channel the user came from, and we're going to group them into categories. So we're going to group them into categories like social or paid ads or organic. So this is a formula or saved metric. And you can do this, but there's some limits to what you can do with it. Cohorts are limited to, they can be useful if you create cohorts of, here are the users, the new users over the last 30 days, or here are the new paid users, or here are users who just canceled the subscription, but they're still active users, things like that. Anything that has machine learning. So if you look at impact, which is special report Mixpanel, it's of course not available here. Monitoring anomaly. I find dashboards is also limited. Effectively, in the free plan, you can save 5 to 10 reports per person. You can quickly start to run into this limit. And once you save a report, you can add it to a dashboard. So things like that. But generally, like I said, it's if you're just getting started, you can start with the free plan, see what this looks like, kind of run into the limits, and then upgrade depending on what you need or what you're looking for. The upgrade process, of course, extremely easy. You can do it on your own, especially if you're going from this plan to this plan, before you're going into the enterprise level. Okay, so that's the pricing level. Just to give you some ballpark numbers of what you might be paying, depending on your user number or your event number. So let's continue on to talk about tracking plans. So a tracking plan is a step that should happen before you ever write any code. The goal with this, and you can do this in the Google Sheets, you can do this in a Google Doc, Word document. There's actual software tools out there that allow you to do this as well. But effectively, you're just creating this Google Sheets. What you want to do in the tracking plan, and the process I follow, is you want to make a note of every possible action that users can take within your product. So I have some examples here. And by the way, this specific Google Sheet, it's actually in the YouTube description. So you can click it, you can make your own copy and use the same format if you like. And you can see the examples, of course. So I have some examples here for different kind of product types. We have meetup.com, which would be a marketplace, a two-sided marketplace. We have Wistia, which would be a B2B product. Indochino, which is an e-commerce site example, and Bejewel, which would be a mobile game example. Let's actually use Bejewel. They all just have different event names just to show you what they might look like based on the different product types. But the concept is still the same. So in the tracking plan, what we want to start with is to make a note of every possible action the user can take in the product. So they can install the app, they can open the app, they can view screens. They might have some onboarding here steps, confirming their age or their name and so on. And then there's a lot of different events. In this case, if you imagine the Bejewel game, the game where you kind of match the little, I don't know, you call them colors, icons, and then you cross them off. You kind of enter a game, you complete the game. You might you reveal hints, game stores, profile events, and so on, right? So this sample plan has about 21 events. In my experience, through different products, if you make a note of every single possible action, you're going to have 20 to 40 events here. Now, you're not going to implement all of them, but it's helpful to see them all in one page so we can get a sense of what's important and what's not. There's a couple of things of, we have some logic of when it fires. Maybe you have some images or videos just so developers know what you're referring to. This can be helpful if you tell them, hey, let's implement when the user clicks the help button, and then having an image or video can be helpful. This is optional. It's, of course, more work, but just an idea. The second thing we want to know is the event properties. Now, event properties simply tell us more information about the action that's taking place. So if you look at this event here called Enter Game Area, the user has entered the game area, maybe we have a type here, a property that specifies what is the game area they enter. In this case, it could be the game area classic or diamond mine or Zen and so on. It depends. You can see there's lots of different event properties here for each specific event. So the event properties give us more detail about the event itself. And this is what allows us to condense events into more global events. Let me see if I have an example here from Indochino, which might be more helpful. Something like this, an order completed is a classic example. You're not going to have multiple events for every single product type that you own. You can just have one single global event called order completed. And within that event, you can have all kinds of properties about the checkout ID, the order ID, the affiliation, the value of the order, the revenue, taxes, shipping, what products were ordered, right? In this case, this will be an array of products and so on. So as much as possible, we want to condense events into global events. It just makes it easier to have global events, and it makes it easier to work with the data. If people know that, hey, for this specific action, orders, there's one single global event that we can use. Then we have user traits, user properties. They tend to be called a little bit differently in every tool, but effectively, these are just properties about the user itself. So common examples here can be name, first name Ruben, last name Ugarte. It could be email. It could be their location, city, region, and country. And of course, it can be custom things you want to add. So for example, we may want to add something like how many games they have played. We may want to add if they are an active subscriber, or if they cancel. We may want to add what kind of subscription plan they are on, and so on, right? Lots of different user properties you can add to just flesh out the user profiles. And you see where it kind of fits in when we get into Mixpanel itself. Mixpanel in particular is sort of built on user profiles. So everything is built at the individual user profile, and then everything gets aggregated at the top. This is a little bit different than something like Google Analytics, which tends to start with aggregated data. And then when you try to filter down, it doesn't quite work that well. And then maybe you have some links and documentation. Typically, I might include here links to any SDKs or things I want to make a note of. So this is the plan. So once you have it on paper, it's very easy to tweak things. You might want to tweak the names to have consistency. If you ever see events that, for example, that are two events that look very similar, that's a clear sign that you should probably condense it into one single event. So you condense, edit, you add properties, you add user properties, and you just make sure everything is clean before you're writing code. Once you have this, then of course you can have priorities. You can say, of the 25 events that we have, let's implement 10. So this will be high priority. And if we want to implement more events, we can do that later on, no problem. But here's the 10 events that we want to start with. A couple of things on naming convention, which I get this a lot. What is the best naming convention? I don't really think there's a best naming convention. And by naming convention, I mean, this is all title case, but this could be, for example, all lowercase. It could be, for example, let's go. It could be camel case, right? So I don't really think that the naming convention matters, specifically what you choose, as long as you're consistent. So whatever you choose, use that. So it could be lowercase, it could be uppercase, it could be camel case. Just stay consistent with all your events, and stay consistent with the event properties, and stay consistent with the user properties. So choose one, use it across the board, and be consistent. There's also debates about this, I think like verb, action, subject, something, whether you make things in the present tense or the past tense and what you do. So for example, this is enter game area. This could be enter game area. Again, I don't think it really matters what you do as long as you're consistent. So in this case, everything here is in the past tense, which is fine. If I were to make it present tense, then I would just change it. So just make a choice, and that's your choice going forward. And the last thing here is everything here, the event names, the properties, the user properties, should be obvious. I think one of the key things that makes data adoption easier is to have very obvious labels for things, event names, properties, and so on. So if I go back to Indochino, if you look at the event names here, they are obvious. Like if you work at this company and you're familiar with the product, you should be able to look at an event and say, I know exactly what that means. Product clicked, product view, product added, checkout started, checkout step, and so on, right? These are very obvious steps. And when we look at the values, there's some obvious nature to it. The worst thing you can do is to have very abstract names, which I have seen, and I have no idea what they mean. They should be very, very obvious things. So don't get sort of cute or fancy here. Make the things obvious. Use the language that you use internally to refer to a specific feature or action that a user can take. And that means, and you'll see this when people are going through a data Mixpanel, they're really not going to be looking at this document. You may have it as a reference, but typically people go into Mixpanel directly. They look at the drop-down menus and then they see what's there. So the more obvious that it is, the more people can say, oh, I get it. I want to look at some coupon-related data. There's a bunch of coupon events. And when I look at them, I know exactly what they mean. Coupon entered, coupon applied, coupon denied, and so on, right? Okay, so that is the tracking plan. Again, whether you use the Google Sheets or something else, doesn't really matter as long as you go through this process. You don't want to do this at the code level because once you do it once, you'll realize that there's a lot of editing that you do around the names, condensing things, properties, removing things, prioritizing. You do it once, maybe you sleep on it, you come back the next day, and you change your mind on a couple things. Very, very easy to do at this stage. Very much hard to do once you kind of get engineers involved and you're writing code and so on. Plus, once you have data in Mixpanel, you really don't want to be sending in wrong data, right? You want to stay consistent because you don't want to pollute your sort of Mixpanel data with the wrong event names and so on. Again, another thing I've seen is sometimes maybe they started with event called enter game area, and then they change their mind multiple times. So in the Mixpanel data, you have like 4 events that are all kind of the same thing. It's very confusing. As much as possible, you want to come in with clean data already thought out of what you want to implement. Anything else I want to mention here? There's a blank one you can use. Again, link is in the YouTube description below. No email, paywall, or anything. You can just go in and make a copy to your own Google Sheets and do it on your own. Okay, so we have the events. There's one more thing that will affect the tracking plan, which is just how you implement the data, what SDK you use, and really the question of client versus backend. So let's jump into that. So the basic implementation of Mixpanel is pretty straightforward. If you look at the JavaScript SDK, and you can see there's several SDKs here, right? You have classic things like JavaScript for web. You have backend SDKs like PHP or Ruby or Java. You're gonna have React Native. You're gonna have client level mobile SDKs like iOS or Android. Unity, there's just a very basic HTTP API that you can use for whatever you need. So lots of different SDKs that allow you to do this out of the box. So if we look at the JavaScript, perhaps the most basic, the standard way for implementing Mixpanel, if you have a web product. There's an SDK that gets added to the page itself. You configure it with your token value. And then the two actions to be done here is be able to track events, right? And tracking an event kind of looks like this. There's a Mixpanel.track. This is the event name we were looking at before, right? The whole enter game area or order completed. And then in here, you can have all the properties, and you can have as many as you want here. You could have 10, 20, 30, 50, 100. That's probably some reasonable limit here, but you can have whatever you want here. You can have strings, you can have numbers, you can have booleans of true and false, and so on, right? You can have lists. So there's a couple of things you can look at if you want to dive deeper into documentation. Then when it comes to users, you want to identify users. This is typically when you take and you want to pass on specific user properties. So if you remember name, email, maybe subscription plan, if they're an active subscriber or not, you will pass all of those as subscription, as user properties in what's called the identify. Typically to identify users, you need some kind of user ID. This user ID is provided by you. It should be persistent. It is very generally the product ID, the backend ID for each user, which will never change no matter what. So you pass that on to Mixpanel, and from that moment on, Mixpanel can then identify that user by that specific user ID. Okay, so that's the most basic thing. There is a couple other methods, of course. You can use the property set once or reset. There's a bunch of other things, group analytics, which we saw earlier, but just the most basic things. What I want to focus here is just a client versus backend, a very common question. The general recommendation in 2024 is you want to use the backend as much as possible. 80%, 90% of your tracking ideally should be in the backend. This helps you avoid ad blockers. Browsers now tend to block data. iOS data tends to be blocked in some ways, and so forth. So there's a lot of blocking that's happening at the client level. It's a general trend that's been going on for 6-7 years. It's just continuing on. So backend tracking tends to be easier and more reliable. Perhaps not so much easier, I take that back, but it's more reliable. And if you can do that, great. There's some things that can only be tracked in the client. So that's why it may never be 100%. But an 80-20 split tends to be a good thing to aim for. Now, pragmatically speaking, backend may be harder for your team. For example, you may have fewer backend engineers than client engineers, something I see very common in companies. That's okay. In that case, you may want to start with an 80%, maybe even 100% client-side tracking. Again, get some comfortable with the product, with the data, and over time, you can replace certain events with backend events. It's something I went through right now where we started with tracking a checkout on the client, and now we are adding a bunch of events to track the same checkout, but on the backend, and we know that's going to increase the data accuracy, is going to increase the data that we're missing due to ad blockers, and eventually we're sort of going to sunset the client-side events. So just make your choices, look at the best SDKs, and then from there, decide what to do. But don't get too caught up in the client versus backend. Just do what's sort of best. I still believe that generally it's better to get started, get comfortable, get some wins, prove the value of tools like this before you ask for more and more resources. I want to do one more thing about the implementation just to give you a sense of how you can debug the data. So let's jump into Mixpanel and we can start to look at the actual tool itself. So we are logged into Mixpanel. This is a sample data set that Mixpanel provides. There's actually about 6 sample data sets for e-commerce, SaaS, social, and so on. You can look at them. Actually, if you want to look at the same data I'm looking at, or just sort of real data and things fleshed out, you can look at the sample data sets. And it gives you a sense of the Mixpanel product without your own data. So I'll use this to walk you through the main functionality. Now, before we move on into using the product, we still want to talk about implementation for a couple more minutes. The goal with any implementation is to get a single profile with all the data that you need. So if you open a single profile in Mixpanel, which looks something like this, this profile will contain events. So here are the different events this user has fired. This is an e-commerce data set. So you can see kind of similar events to what we were looking at in the tracking plan: product added, product view, and so on. Every event has properties. Some are tracked by Mixpanel out of the box. So anything we do with, city, region, device information. There's some UTM information that Mixpanel tracks out of the box. Some are set manually. So page name, page variant, and cart in this case. And together you get the entire sort of payload for each event. So the first thing when you start to implement Mixpanel, and this is what you can work towards, you want to make sure that everything you want to track, it's here. So when you look at a specific event, you can see it being tracked here, and you're seeing the right values. That's step number one. Step number two is making sure that all the user properties that you're passing are also stored here. So down here, we have the user profile properties. Again, some things are tracked by Mixpanel out of the box, like browser, city, region. And then other things are, of course, passed on by you, like email, right? Enable permissions will be one. Gender will be another one, right? UTM data is tracked by Mixpanel out of the box. Payment methods added will be something that's done manually, and so forth. So whatever you're passing that has been manual, it should be here, and the right value should be available. If you're passing a user ID, the user ID should be here. So whatever the user ID that you have passed on, it will be available here. So you should be able to look for it and see it. So this is success. Success is having a single user profile with all the activity. If you're tracking across devices, let's say you're tracking data on web, iOS, and Android, very common situation, all the data from all 3 devices, all the events, all the user properties that get passed on in each device should be seen in a single profile. That's it. If you're having multiple profiles, there's something you have to check on your user ID or something else. Some debugging might be needed, but this is success. A single profile for every user with all their activity, no matter where the activity is coming from. And you can do this from any number of devices. You could have backend data, web data, iOS data, Android data, anything else in a single profile, and all the events are coming in a timeline that makes sense. They all come in at the right time, the right day, and so on. That's success. That's what you want to work towards. This is the users report, right? When you open the user report, you'll see all the different users here, and you can see their information and open the profile. And you can look for users by email or user ID. There's lots of different ways you can filter down for users to find your specific users. The events report is also used for debugging in a way. The events report is showing you the events coming in real time. One of the big benefits of Mixpanel is that all the data gets processed in nearly real time. If you look at some of the Google Analytics, sometimes you may have a lag of up to 24 hours, sometimes even 48 hours, depending on the data. So the Mixpanel data, if you send an event, you'll see it here within a minute, right? And you can see that this was updated less than a minute ago. You can refresh it, and it'll give you new events. So as you're debugging things, you can do this, and you can see the events. Again, the events come in. You can see your properties, the Mixpanel properties, and so on. You're not going to see the user properties here, and you're not going to see where everything's coming in into a single user profile. For that, we have to open the profiles themselves, which you can do by clicking this. That kind of takes you to the same place, the same user profile screen. But nonetheless, that's the 2 things for debugging, just to give you a high level of what success is. A single user profile with all the activities from any number of devices, and making sure your events are coming in with all the properties at the right time and the right date. All right, so we gone through a lot. So we looked at the use cases, the pricing, we looked at the tracking plan, which is a huge step to make sure you have the right data. We talked a little bit about SDKs, the client versus backend, and some couple best practices for implementation as you kind of get this data in. By this point in time, you have determined the best way to track data. Maybe it was through JavaScript or iOS or Android. You added the little code snippets wherever it was relevant in your product. And now there's data coming in with the right event names, the right event properties. And now we can finally look at the actual product itself of Mixpanel. Before I jump into the Mixpanel demo, I want to give you just a quick note that if you're looking for help implementing Mixpanel as part of a larger stack for your company, and you want to go through the steps, you want guidance on a lot of the things we talked about, the right pricing, the right SDKs, the right tracking plan, making sure it displays well with your other existing tools, that you have all the tools that you need, get in touch. There's a link in the description, rubenugarte.com/analytics. That page contains all the details for how I work with companies and help them implement tools like Mixpanel to get way more insights than they ever thought possible. The page contains pricing, it contains information on how the projects worked, testimonials, more about me. It's a single page. It tells you everything you need to know. If you like what you see on the page, if you think we might be a good fit, get in touch. There's a form on the page itself you can fill out, and I'll get back to you, and then we can check to see if this is a good fit. But typically, the implementation help I give companies can fast track the process. It's something that might take you 3, 4, 5 months. You can do it in 6 weeks, 8 weeks. You can get faster insights. You can start working through those improvements to the product, to the onboarding, making sure that your marketing spend is being used appropriately, all of that. So check out the link, rubenugarte.com/analytics. And with that being said, let's continue on with the video. So there's a few things that are going on here. The bulk of our reporting is, of course, here in the reports. This is just a basic account with insights, funnels, flows, and retention. There's other more advanced reports around impact and things that use machine learning, which will be available in some accounts, right? Like Signal and Impact and so on. There's a few other features. We're not going to go through every single thing. I just want to give you an overview of the most important things. So the most important report, by far and large, is Insights. This is where you're going to spend the most amount of time, and this is your key report that you can use it to do a lot of stuff. So in this Insights report, we're taking the events and think of those as our building blocks, and we're going to start to build reports. So let's say we want to look at the order completed, which in this data set is called purchase completed. So we can take the event, pop it in, and right away we get a report here by Mixpanel. So this report is telling us that over the last 30 days, this is how many unique users, you see it here, have completed this event called purchase completed. They made a purchase of some kind. We can go from unique users to total events, which in this case will correspond to total orders, right? They're probably very similar, but they might be different in other ways. We could change the date range from, let's say, last 30 days to last 3 months. Maybe we don't want to make it monthly intervals. We want to still keep it to weekly intervals. So let's do that. Maybe a line chart doesn't quite make sense. How about a stack line, right? And so on. So you can start to see that this is how Mixpanel works. It's very easy. Once you have all the building blocks in place, you've done the right event names, you have all the event properties, kind of put them together in a recipe. It's quite straightforward. Now, the huge value of Mixpanel is being able to break down things, to segment things. So we can go and do a breakdown, and we have event properties. So you can see these are all the event properties that are being tracked with this event. Some of them, as we know, they are default, browser, city, and so on. But some of them are custom. They were passed on by a specific team. For example, payment method. So now we're breaking down the total number of orders, total events, over the last 3 months by payment method. Credit card, PayPal, Apple Pay, and Afterpay. And from here, we can change this. Maybe you want a pie chart. Might make more sense here, right? Or maybe we want, let's say, a bar, which kind of gives us numbers, right? We can sort it depending on what we want, and so forth. Now we can continue adding things. Perhaps we want to not only do payment method, but we also want to do shipping method. We want to combine both of them. And now we create a segment on the segment. So for every user who uses credit card, here's the breakdown of shipping method: standard shipping, express, next day shipping, and so on, right? And we can continue on for maybe 10 or 15 different segments. Might be the total limit here. So you can do a lot of different combinations and permutations, and you can start to see that right away within a few minutes. You can get very clear insights on what's going on within your product. How are users actually behaving? What are they doing? What are they not doing? We can filter things. For example, we may have too much data here. We may, for example, only be interested in standard shipping. So we want to look at only users who chose standard shipping. So let's filter that. And we can see what percentage then corresponds to credit cards. The filters, of course, vary. We have is not, contains, and so on, the typical things. For breakdowns, we can continue adding things. Maybe we want to add, for example, some user properties. Let's say by country. And let's look at what we have for country here. We might have a couple of things for country. So let's take country here. And so on. So now we continue to have this breakdown of payment method, shipping method, and now by country, and seeing the data itself. So from here, you go on and on to get what specific insights you want. This may be a one-off report. You may not care too much about it, or it may be something you want to save. In this case, you can save it. You can give it a title. You can add it to a dashboard, which are called boards here. And you can then come back to it. And this report will always be updated. Again, typically because the data in Mixpanel comes in real time, generally everything you see is up to the last few minutes. And if you're not sure, you can always try to refresh the data, which is an option as well, right? So you see here, the data was refreshed a minute ago. You can refresh it if you think there might be something missing here. We can do some comparisons, of course. We can compare to a previous period. In this case, it might be the previous 3 months or a previous day and so on. We can compare segments and so on. So there's other comparisons here that I'm not going to get completely into it. But this is the insights report. As you can see, it can be very easy to build things and filter out and do breakdowns. And you can start to, with different combination, different building blocks, you can get to very specific granular parts of your product and understand exactly what's going on. Now, the magic here, to make this really easy, we have to go through all the steps we did before, right? The tracking plan, the implementation, all of that is the prerequisites to make this super easy. But if you do that, you can come in. The biggest issues I see with Mixpanel implementations is they haven't done through those steps. So they can't actually build this in the way I just did it now in just a few minutes because they don't have the building blocks. The events are not logical. They're not obvious. They're not correct. There's like tracking errors. So you're only seeing 60% of all the purchases instead of 100% because there's some error somewhere. So you really want to make sure the implementation, the tracking plan is correct. And then the actual usage of the product tends to be quite easy. You can change the colors of the charts, which I think is kind of cool, right? You maybe want to make it more like your colors. Just a couple of things, right? And maybe make a theme and so on. Okay, so let's move on to another report, which will be funnels. Again, very, very useful. So if we take, let's maybe see if we can build up the checkout funnel here. We're probably going to have a checkout started. And I think we have a product added, which is actually up here, step 1. And let's take the same purchase completed. Let's see. Let's start with a simple funnel. Funnels. Okay. So funnels are amazing because you can build them just as quickly, you can destroy them just as quickly, and you can have lots of different permutations. So funnels are great for checkout funnels and e-commerce sites, onboarding funnels, any kind of flow. If you imagine like a food delivery app, like Skip the Dishes or Uber Eats, right? There's a flow of steps users go through to put an order. So you can put all the steps here. You can see I just added the steps here that made sense. So users add a product to cart, then how many of those users start checkout, and how many of those users actually complete an order. And we have a complete, an overall conversion rate here of almost 11% for this checkout funnel. From there, there's a few things we can play with, right? We have a conversion window of some kind, a conversion criteria. So we're saying within 7 days, but we can make this very tight, right? We can make this seconds or minutes. We might actually say, within 10 minutes of users added to product, what does it look like? In this case, you can see it's actually not much. So the data might need to be changed to make it a little longer. and so on. So we'll keep it maybe 1 day. Okay. So you play around with the window of your funnel, which again gives you a lot of granularity because you can look at actions very, very tightly instead of having huge windows over, like a 30-day window may be completely useless in many cases. A food ordering funnel might be completed within 15 minutes at most. We can look at conversion rate. We can again look at total conversion. So again, this will be related to total orders, not just the number of unique users that converted. And we can then break this down by perhaps revenue or some kind of other property. Now, the breakdowns here, again, we can kind of do the same thing. We can perhaps take payment method as an example. And we're actually going to, so this is a great example. So we had a payment method, and we can see that there's no values. So the values we saw before of credit card, PayPal, and so on are not available. What's going on here is that it is trying to segment, do the breakdown on step 1. However, we know that the payment method is actually on step 3. So we can actually change this, and boom. And now we can get this breakdown of the payment method by the third step, and then see what the data looks like overall, right? Let's do another breakdown that will be available on step 1. Maybe country. Let's try that. Okay. So now we can kind of see the top countries in this case. There's lots of different countries, but there's a limit to how many we can show in the funnel itself. And we see the top countries by number of products added, and then we see their specific conversion rates here to each step, and so on. So we can start to look at for interesting segments, interesting insights on different breakdowns. Let's do that. We can again do the same filter before, maybe filter down to only the US or something like that. Maybe we want to look at specific products, what is the conversion rate, the purchase rate for those specific products, and so on. Lots of variations, right? Lots of ways you can build this out once you have those building blocks in place. And a typical implementation with, let's say, 10, 15 events, there might be another 30, 40, 50 unique event properties. So you have a lot of different permutations to filter down and get very, very specific with what's going on. This is great for companies that are accustomed to very high level numbers, right? Where they know what the checkout conversion rate is, but they cannot segment down to specific product lines, specific countries, specific marketing sources. Mixpanel that makes this all really easy. There's a few other things we can do. A couple duplicate functionality, right? For example, if we want to filter down by a specific product, we can do it here at this level instead of doing it at the entire funnel level. But this is just mostly minor details that you will get familiar over time as you get familiar with the product. Funnels are also a great way to look at A/B tests. Very common use case in my work, where we set up an A/B test, we design it, we might have specific events for each A/B test, and then we can actually put the variations, the control versus variation 1, 2, and 3, and then look at the conversion rate through an entire funnel and see which variation performs best, not just at high-level metrics like clicks or page views, but a complete conversion down the funnel. And because we can make the windows broad, you can see we can go all the way to months. So we could easily make this, let's say, a 6-month window. That means that we can look at conversions in a very long time. So we can look at users not only who make a purchase, but who actually become long-term subscribers, over 6 months or 12 months or something like that. So lots of flexibility here in the funnels, and the data can change depending on it, which is a good point to note that you want to become comfortable with the data because now you have lots of it. There's lots of different sort of FYIs of like, this report looks like this because of this, and it doesn't look like that because of this. So this is just things that is something to become familiar with as you have more and more data. So this is the second major report, insights being the first one, funnels being the second one. And then we look at retention as the third one. And in this case, why don't we look at, see if we have a sign up event. Okay. And let's look at the same purchase event. Okay, I'll play this. So retention tells us how sticky the product is, or how often users are coming back to the product. This is a cohort analysis, very classic report. It's simply telling us, of the number of users who signed up over the period, how many of them made a purchase within 1 day, or 2 days, or 3 days, and so forth, right? In this case, we can see, for example, that I'm going to make this week so we have a little more data here. On the week of March 6th, there were 2,000 users who signed up. And here's the percentage of those users that then made a purchase on this specific day. Within 7 days, this X number of users actually made a purchase here. And then we get a retention curve. So we can understand that, for example, on day 30th, typically about 1% of users are still making purchases. So this is very helpful for mobile games, consumer apps, even B2B apps and subscription data can be helpful here to understand what the retention looks like at day 7, day 30th, day 90th, day 180th, and so on. And just like before, we build it using our building blocks of different events. We can do filters, we can do breakdowns, everything that we saw before, we can do it here. And there's some specific retention metrics here that you can use in this report. So this is helpful. This report tends to need time to build. So if you just set up Mixpanel, you're not going to have this report because naturally you need 30 days, 60, 90 days, or whatever to really get data. But once you have it, you can then start to see the roll-on changes over time and look at lots of different filters and way in which this is changed. Now, we looked at users, we looked at events, which are helpful for debugging and also helpful in other ways. Something else I'll mention here is anything that you see in a chart, you can also export either to a CSV or PNG, depending on what you have, depending on what the chart is. So it's often helpful to have tables and then be able to export that into some kind of data format. And let's look at boards, which are the dashboards. So you can build a dashboard and then add as many reports as you want. So here's, for example, a dashboard. You can see this is it's nice because you can have some text to guide the viewers of the dashboard to what's going on, and then specific reports and their high level numbers. And if you ever want to dive in, you can just click into it and you have the same expanded view. I find with this dashboards that it's a great balance for users who just want to look at the high level numbers at a glance, while also giving some users the ability to open it, add their own filters, breakdowns without actually saving their changes. So they can make this temporary tweaks to the report, get some other insight, and it just gives them a starting point. So there's lots of different ways of playing with the data without affecting it. So this is the dashboard. Again, you can see it's great. I especially like the text. I think having text is helpful because there's always context that needs to be added to reports and dashboards. And there's only so much you can do with the design of your reports and charts. So having text, I think, is just fantastic. So props to Mixpanel for doing that. And of course, flexibility in the size and layout. You can actually change the style of the chart type. So you have some options here. For example, right, you can make it a line chart versus a bar chart and so on. And let's see if we have another chart. This is samples. Got it. So this is view only. When you have edit, you can have some flexibility too. But you can actually add some filters here, right? So change the date ranges, maybe even add actual specific filters that get added. So maybe you want to look at, if you keep that payment method filter that we've been using, maybe tweak or filter an entire dashboard by a specific payment method and so on. There's some options for sharing dashboards to email and a few other things. You can do those. And of course, there's like TV mode for those companies that like to put dashboards on TVs. Okay, let's see what else we got here. This is a dashboard actually that Mixpanel uses just to explain things, but helpful. You can see there's videos and charts and so on. So this is a dashboard functionality. Very helpful. Once you build your reports, you can add text and guidance, and that becomes a very great way to be able to share data with the rest of your team. Now, the final thing I want to mention here is data integrations. So at this point in time, the ability to integrate data has become core to tools like Mixpanel. Typically, you can bring data in and you can bring data out. So you have, for example, data pipelines. We saw the add-on in the Pricing, so you can export data into common data warehouses like BigQuery and Amazon S3 and so on. You can also export data to a lot of other integrations. Typically, this is sort of email-based or something like that. For example, if we look at Facebook ads is a good example, actually. You could take audiences, so you could build a cohort of users in Mixpanel. Let's say new users over the last 30 days, new being users who just signed up. You can create a cohort of these users and then export that as an audience to Facebook and then do some kind of remarketing campaign on those users, as an example. So there's different ways to export data. It varies depending on what the destination looks like, but that's just an option. Something else I was going to mention too is when we look at the tracking and implementation, you can of course do that through your own SDK, the SDK method we talked about. But there is an option to actually connect a data warehouse, which may already have some product data, bring that to Mixpanel, and then Mixpanel will visualize that for you. So just an option, depending on where your data is stored. And if you already have some data, you can kind of bring that in as a data option. Some of the other things that you'll become familiar, cohorts, we talked about briefly. Lexicon is just a way to organize your data. So, when you have event names, you can add descriptions to help users get familiar with what the events actually mean. There's some metrics here, mostly for people who manage the data for event volume and things like that. Anything that's sort of custom, you can create custom events that combine events together. For example, you may want to combine the purchase event and a subscription started event, which are two actions, but they kind of talk about the same thing. Users become paying customers. And you can combine it into a single event, a custom event, and then take that custom event to all the reports we saw. There's lookup tables, which are actually quite useful, where you can do lookup based on values. So you have some input, list of values on the left, and then you have some output on the right. Formulas, which we talked about before with the marketing channels, the organic, social, and so on. And behaviors are just some specific filters that you want to save and reuse that over and over again. So that's really it. That is the how to get started Mixpanel in I think less than 60 minutes, hopefully. So we looked at a lot: the use cases, the pricing, the tracking plan, the SDKs, the implementation best practices, key actions to get to the point where you saw before, where things are really easy to build. You have to go through the steps. The more work you put in there, the easier Mixpanel will be when it comes time to build reports and dashboards. And of course, we looked at the actual demo itself, the insights, funnels, retentions, dashboards, the data integration, and so on. That is all I have for this video. So thank you. That is all I have for today. My name is Ruben Ugarte. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe. There's a few links in the description box I want to make you aware of. There's a link for information about how I help companies implement tools like Mixpanel, rubenugarte.com/analytics. Check that out if that's something that's of interest to you. There's also a link to the tracking plan you saw earlier before. It's a Google Sheets, no paywall, no email. You can just open it, make a copy to your Google account, or download an Excel. There's also a link to subscribe to the channel if you want to do that. And finally, in the comments section below, let me know what you think about Mixpanel. Maybe some of the questions you might have. I'll do my best to answer them. But with all that being said, I hope you enjoy this, and we'll talk soon.